We often assume that people who use sex toys are compensating for something missing. But what if, instead, they're actually in touch with something most of us are too afraid to explore? What if the choice to incorporate these objects into one's intimate life reflects not a deficit, but a kind of courage? The willingness to acknowledge desire, to experiment with pleasure, and to take ownership of one's own body in ways that society has historically discouraged or pathologized. The narrative surrounding sex toys has long been distorted by shame, misunderstanding, and the twin forces of moral panic and prurient fascination. For decades, cultural messaging has suggested that those who use such devices must be sexually inadequate, relationally deficient, or morally suspect. Yet when we examine the actual psychology behind their use, we discover something far more nuanced and fundamentally human. A complex tapestry of motivations, rooted in curiosity, self-discovery, healing, connection, and the deeply ingrained human drive to understand and experience pleasure. Consider for a moment the profound vulnerability involved in acknowledging what brings you pleasure. We live in a culture that simultaneously sexualizes everything and yet maintains deep reservoirs of shame around actual sexual experience and exploration. From childhood, many of us receive contradictory messages that our bodies are both precious and shameful, that sexuality is both natural and dangerous, that desire is both inevitable and something to be controlled, hidden, or denied. Against this backdrop, the decision to explore one's sexuality intentionally, whether alone or with a partner, becomes an act of psychological integration, a refusal to allow external judgment to dictate internal experience. The motivations behind using sex toys are as diverse as human sexuality itself. For some, the journey begins with simple curiosity, the same impulse that drives us to taste new foods, travel to unfamiliar places, or learn new skills. Human beings are exploratory creatures by nature. We are wired to seek novelty, to test boundaries, and to expand our understanding of what is possible. When applied to sexuality, it asks, what do I respond to? What sensations does my body crave? What fantasies live in the corners of my imagination? And what happens when I give them form? This process of discovery is not trivial. In fact, it represents a fundamental aspect of psychological development that sexologists and therapists have long recognized as essential to sexual health. The pioneering sex researcher Alfred Kinsey understood that human sexuality exists on a spectrum, that it is variable, complex, and deeply individual. His work, along with that of researchers like Masters and Johnson, helped establish that sexual satisfaction is not a given, but something that requires self-awareness, communication, and often experimentation. For many people, sex toys become tools in this process of self-education, a way to understand their own bodies without the complications of another person's needs, expectations, or judgments. But beyond curiosity lies something even more profound: the reclamation of autonomy. For women especially, whose sexuality has historically been controlled, commodified, or defined by others, the use of sex toys can represent a radical act of self-determination. Consider the long history of medical and cultural authorities dictating what women should feel, want, or experience sexually. Consider the Victorian-era diagnosis of hysteria, often treated with what we would now recognize as medically administered orgasms. Consider the countless generations of women told that their pleasure was secondary, irrelevant, or even non-existent. Against this historical backdrop, a woman choosing to explore her own pleasure independently becomes something revolutionary, a declaration that her body belongs to her, that her pleasure matters, and that she need not wait for permission or partnership to access her own sensuality. This is not a rejection of intimacy with others, but rather a foundation for it. Psychologist and sex therapist Esther Perel has written extensively about how erotic self-acknowledge enhances rather than diminishes connection with partners. When we understand what brings us pleasure, we can communicate that knowledge, inviting partners into a co-created experience rather than expecting them to divine our needs through guesswork. For others, sex toys serve as bridges back to pleasure after trauma has disrupted that connection. Sexual trauma, whether from assault, abuse, or even negative cultural conditioning, can create profound disconnections between mind and body. Survivors often describe feeling numb, dissociated, or deeply afraid of their own sexuality. In these contexts, the controlled, private exploration that sex toys allow can become part of a healing process. They offer a way to reclaim sensation and pleasure at one's own pace, without the vulnerability and potential triggering effects of another person's touch. Trauma-informed therapists recognize that healing is not linear, and that each person's path back to wholeness looks different. For some, vibrators or other devices become tools that help them recognize that their bodies can still feel pleasure, that sexuality need not be forever tainted by violation. This is not about rushing towards sexual functioning, but about slowly, carefully, rebuilding trust with one's own body. It's about recognizing that pleasure is a birthright, not something that trauma can permanently steal. The use of sex toys within relationships reveals another layer of psychological complexity. Far from being signs of relational inadequacy, they often reflect emotional intelligence and communicative maturity. Couples who incorporate toys into their intimate lives are typically those who have done the difficult work of talking openly about desire, who have moved beyond the fiction that good sex should be effortless and instinctive, and who recognize that arousal and pleasure can be enhanced through creativity and mutual exploration. Research in relationship psychology consistently shows that sexual satisfaction is strongly correlated with communication. Couples who can discuss their desires, boundaries, and fantasies openly tend to report higher levels of both sexual and relational satisfaction. Sex toys become part of this conversation. Props in an ongoing dialogue about what feels good, what might be interesting to try, and how partners can continue to surprise and delight each other, even in long-term relationships, where familiarity might otherwise breed predictability. There's also something to be said about the role of sex toys in addressing the reality of sexual incompatibility or differing desire levels in relationships. Many partnerships involve mismatched libidos or different preferences for how sex unfolds. Rather than viewing these differences as insurmountable problems, some couples find that toys offer solutions that honor both partners' needs. One partner might use a vibrator during sex to reach orgasm more easily, reducing pressure on the other partner to perform in specific ways. Or toys might be used during solo time when partners' desire levels don't align, allowing for sexual expression without guilt or resentment. This pragmatic approach reflects a mature understanding that no single person can or should be expected to meet all of another person's needs, sexual or otherwise. It challenges the romantic mythology that the one will automatically and effortlessly fulfill every desire. Instead, it embraces a more realistic and ultimately more sustainable view that love involves creativity, adaptation, and the willingness to support each other's well-being in diverse ways. Let's also consider the philosophical dimensions of why humans create and use technologies of pleasure. From the earliest carved figurines to modern app-controlled devices, humans have always crafted tools to enhance experience. This is not unique to sexuality. We create instruments to make music, telescopes to see distant stars, virtual reality to simulate new worlds. The impulse to expand human experience through technology is fundamental to who we are as a species. In this light, sex toys are simply one expression of a broader human drive, the desire to intensify, prolong, or diversify experience. They reflect our refusal to accept our baseline sensory apparatus as the limit of what's possible. French philosopher Michel Foucault wrote extensively about how sexuality is not merely a biological given, but something actively constructed through discourse, practice, and power relations. The choice to use sex toys can be seen as an act of self-dictatorship within this constructed realm. A way of saying, I will not accept the narrow definitions of normal sexuality imposed by culture. I will explore for myself. Of course, any honest exploration of this topic must also acknowledge the anxiety it provokes. Why does the image of someone using a vibrator or other device trigger such discomfort in so many people? Part of this reaction stems from deeply embedded cultural narratives about what sex should be. We're taught that authentic sexuality is spontaneous, natural, and achieved through bodies alone. The introduction of objects disrupts this narrative, suggesting that natural pleasure might be insufficient, that bodies might need augmentation. But this anxiety reveals more about our cultural hang-ups than about the reality of human sexuality. The notion that anything artificial diminishes authentic experience is peculiar when we apply it consistently. We don't consider music less authentic because it's made with instruments rather than just voices. We don't consider meals less nourishing because they're cooked with tools rather than eaten raw. Yet when it comes to sex, we maintain this fiction that only unassisted bodies engaged in specific acts count as real intimacy. This anxiety also connects to deeper fears about obsolescence and inadequacy. If a vibrator can deliver reliable pleasure, what does that mean about human lovers? But this question misunderstands both the technology and the nature of human connection. A vibrator can provide physical sensation, but it cannot provide eye contact, emotional vulnerability, playfulness, surprise, or the profound psychological experience of being desired by and desiring another consciousness. It cannot hold you afterward, or laugh with you, or grow with you over time. Sex toys don't replace human connection. They're simply tools that some people find useful in the pursuit of pleasure, whether alone or together. The fear that they might replace people reveals our cultural tendency to reduce sex to mechanical functioning, rather than recognizing it as a complex biopsychosocial phenomenon, in which physical sensation is just one component among many. There's also something important to say about how the use of sex toys can intersect with broader projects of sexual liberation and social justice. For LGBTQ+ individuals, for disabled people, for those whose bodies or desires don't fit conventional templates, sex toys can offer pathways to pleasure that might otherwise be difficult to access. They represent a democratization of pleasure, a recognition that everyone deserves to experience their sexuality fully, regardless of whether their bodies or desires conform to mainstream expectations. For disabled individuals especially, adaptive toys and creative use of devices can be transformative, allowing for sexual expression that ableist cultural scripts suggest should be impossible or irrelevant. This challenges the pernicious notion that only certain bodies are entitled to pleasure and that sexuality is the province of the young, able-bodied, and conventionally attractive. The availability and normalization of sex toys helps dismantle these hierarchies, insisting that pleasure is a human right, not a privilege granted only to some. Similarly, for older adults navigating the changes that aging brings to bodies and relationships, sex toys can help maintain or rediscover sexual connection. As bodies change, as erections become less reliable, as natural lubrication decreases, as joints become less flexible, tools and devices can help people adapt, rather than simply accepting the end of sexual loss. This reframes aging not as a process of inevitable loss, but as a series of transitions that require creativity and adaptation. What emerges from all these perspectives is a picture of sex toy use not as pathology or deviation, but as an expression of agency, curiosity, and self-care. It reflects an unwillingness to let shame, fear, or cultural prohibition dictate the terms of one's intimate life. It represents a kind of psychological integration, the bringing together of body, mind, and desire in ways that honor, rather than suppress, fundamental aspects of being human. Of course, like any aspect of sexuality, the use of sex toys can become problematic when it's driven by compulsion rather than choice, when it serves as an escape from rather than an enhancement of human connection, or when it's pursued in ways that cause distress. But these concerns apply equally to any sexual behavior. The question is never whether an act involves certain objects or practices, but whether it's undertaken with intentionality, consent, self-awareness, and care for one's self and others. The most psychologically healthy approach to sexuality, whether it involves toys or not, is one characterized by curiosity without compulsion, openness without pressure, and pleasure pursued as an end in itself, rather than as a means of proving something or compensating for perceived inadequacy. When sex toys are used in this spirit, they become exactly what they appear to be: tools that some people find helpful in the pursuit of well-being. So perhaps the question we should ask is not, why do people use sex toys? But rather, why has it taken us so long to acknowledge that pleasure matters, that self-acknowledge is valuable, and that humans have always sought to enhance experience through creativity and technology? The use of sex toys reflects not a departure from authentic humanity, but a deep engagement with it, with our capacity for invention, our hunger for sensation, our need to understand ourselves, and our fundamental right to author our own experiences. In acknowledging this, we move beyond judgment and into a more spacious understanding of human sexuality, one that recognizes diversity, validates agency, and insists that pleasure, far from being trivial or shameful, is a legitimate dimension of a life well lived. This is not about promoting any particular practice, but about defending the right of each person to explore their own sexuality in ways that feel authentic and meaningful to them, free from the burden of others' fear, projection, or narrow definitions of what it means to be sexual, intimate, and human.